Okay. All right. So welcome to our February Amazon Conservation Through Education webinar. As you know, tonight, the topic is all about plants with Dr. Rob from the New York Botanical Garden. But I wanted to give you a preview of what's coming up and encourage you to get registered for the upcoming webinars. If you don't know the Morpho Institute, we work to promote Amazon awareness and appreciation and conservation through the lens of education. So we have some stellar faculty. Rob is one of those. And then coming up in April, we'll have other faculty, the Bug Chicks, Christy Reddick and Jess Honecker. And they'll be talking about Amazon arthropods and the connection to social emotional learning in the classroom. And then in April and May, we've got a series of webinars from some of our new collaborators and partners. Globe Observers, a citizen science app that students are using and citizen scientists are using to collect data around the world, and that's run through NASA. And then Pocket Lab is a partner of ours, and they have environmental technology that we use in the field, and so it'll be a great opportunity to get to know their resources and how they can be used in the classroom. And then finally, on May 4th, we'll be talking about designing student field investigations with a terrific organization, the Pacific Education Institute out in Washington State. And we use a lot of their resources in the field with our educators. So if you're interested in those events and want to get signed up, you can just go to morphoinstitute.org/events, and you'll see the full lineup and all the links to get going. So without further ado, let's introduce Dr. Rob Naczi from the New York Botanical Garden. Rob joined us as faculty back in March of 2020, quite literally as the world was beginning to close down. We were actually in the Amazon with a bunch of teachers when word came out that borders were closing, schools were closing, and we were all lucky enough to already have flights booked out of the country, and we all got home safely, and then waited for 2 whole years to get back. And then last summer, Rob joined us in the field again to help us launch our new Amazon research initiative for educators. And so we are just thrilled and delighted to have Rob with us. I like to think of Rob as a tropical ecologist. He would say he's not, but he's the best tropical ecologist I've ever met. So we're gonna give him that honorary title through the Morpho Institute. But his role at New York Botanical Garden is the Arthur Conquest Curator of North American Botany. He focuses on the sedge family, and I have to admit, once I know what a sedge is, I can't unsee sedges. I see them everywhere now. And then he also specializes in North American pitcher plants, which are equally as amazing and terrific. So I would like to turn it over to Rob to get going so that we can have a deep dive into Amazon Rainforest Plants and all their wonders. So Rob, I'm going to stop sharing and let you go ahead, and Nancy and I will monitor the chat for you.
Krista, thanks so much. Let's see. Hopefully you can see my presentation now.
I sure can.
Wonderful. Krista, thank you so much for that kind introduction. You really honor me greatly, and I appreciate that. It's a thrill for me to be here because I see so many friends that I've known for a while, and then friends that I hope to make in the future, hopefully even in Peru this summer. So what I'd like to do tonight is talk about many of the ways that botanical diversity really does impact the rainforest. And what I'd like to do before we get started is first mention that the New York Botanical Garden is located in the ancestral homeland of the Lenape or Delaware people. We honor them and acknowledge their displacement, dispossession, and continued presence. Well, when I start looking at plants, I think of all these wonderful features that draw me to the Amazon. I'm seeing all kinds of forms, textures, colors, fragrances, and then I began to wonder about why. And one of the things that I want to mention right from the start is I'd like this to be interactive. So if you have questions along the way, please go ahead and ask, either in the chat or go ahead and unmute and just go ahead and ask. There will be a few times when I'll ask you questions, in fact. So it'll be nice to have your feedback. But as I say, go ahead anytime. So what I'd like to do to get us started is think about what plants do functionally, ecologically, and we call what various organisms do for the environment and for us as part of that environment. We call these ecosystem services. Usually these are things that are ecological functions that we take for granted, but from which we greatly benefit. So what I'd like to do is think about ecosystem services in two different ways. First for us, and then for the environment. And I'd like all of you now to come up with as many different ways that you know that rainforest plants benefit us. And then I'll show you the list. Right now the screen is blank, but the list that I came up with, and we'll see. It's quite likely you come up with more. So I'm seeing some wonderful things. Medicine, food, medicine again, oxygen, absolutely, shelter, clothing, keep them coming, carbon sink, building materials, this is great, absolutely, evapotranspiration, yes, water cycling, cleans the water, all of this is great. Any more? Whoops. I wanted to show you these images. You're already a jump ahead of me, but I wanted to show you these images to give you some hints. You've already come up with so many on your own, but beauty, absolutely. Habitat for others. Any more before I show you the list I came up with? Honestly, I think you've come up with just about everything I came up with, probably even more. Transportation, yes. That's one that I think I missed. Okay, I'll go ahead and show you the list that I came up with. And you had, I think, everything I did, except for maybe poisons. Oh, there are a couple more things toward the bottom there. Incredibly important things. We did have beauty, but I also like to mention a close connection with wonder and awe and inspiration that the rainforest, especially rainforest plants, provide for us. Also think about spirituality and recreation and what we're doing now, education. Okay, now it's time to come up with what rainforest plants do for the rest of the ecosystem. So please go ahead and either type in the chat or go ahead and just unmute and mention some possibilities for, not just possibilities, but realities for what rainforest plants do for the environment. Okay, there are a lot of great things coming here. Temperature stabilization, habitat for animals, carbon sink, absolutely. Energy transfer, yes, that was my number one, as you'll see in a minute. Food and shelter, erosion control, yes, absolutely. Wonderful, wonderful. Any more? I'm looking through the list. Oxygen, yes, absolutely. Habitat, you got it. Remember, rainforest plants are taking the sun's energy and making it available for the entire rest of the food chain, the entire rest of the ecosystem. Also, the plants provide the habitat, they make the habitat. And then I think virtually everything else I have on that list, you have mentioned, and it's wonderful. I did want to point out resilience. Rainforests so far have been quite resilient to the environmental changes that have been happening as part of global change. They have stepped up and absorbed much of the carbon that we've been generating, but we do suspect, as you've probably seen in recent press, that we may be nearing a tipping point. So that's why I say within limits. This is something we need to be very concerned about. Another one that I wanted to point out is supporting ecological interactions, and that's something that I'll be talking about quite a bit for the rest of this webinar. I'm seeing some more good things. Tourism, absolutely. And that's both for us and for the environment and our impact on the environment. Okay, this is great. So this kind of puts us in a frame of mind. And what I'd like to do now is return to all that wonderful diversity that I was talking about before. It's just astonishing. It's beyond our human comprehension how much diversity is out there in terms of the species and their appearances and their ecologic traits and how they interact with other organisms. Now, how do we comprehend this diversity, this bewildering array of diversity? How do we come to terms with it? Well, I wanted to discuss that for a little bit. And really what I'm talking about here at the center is the discipline of biology that we call systematics. I am a plant systematist, and I realize that systematics and systematists are mysterious to most people, so I wanted to put them in context here. So what happens is, consider all the diversity, and systematists are those people who do the fundamental research to deal with that diversity in the sense of making it comprehensible to our human minds. And within systematics, specifically, what we do is we document that diversity. We explore the natural world, we identify the organisms we find, and we name them along the way. We also infer their relationships, and we classify them. And in turn, what all of this does is it provides basic biodiversity knowledge, which is absolutely essential for the rest of life. But here I'm focusing on the fact that it's one of the major sources of information for conservation. After all, we can conserve only what we know. And we know these things through the field of systematics. And the ultimate goal, of course, of conservation is species survival. So what is so important here is that systematics is foundational. It's also hypothesis driven, and it's fueled by data, starting with specimens themselves, a form of data. Also, systematics is integrated. It draws on every field of science, such as chemistry and morphology, and we bring in other fields too, like statistics and molecular biology. Also, systematics is totally transformative. It's an unfinished synthesis, and it always will be as long as we have biodiversity. And it's absolutely essential. Now, you might realize here that I'm being a salesman, and I readily admit, because as I've mentioned, systematics and systematists are mysterious to the vast majority of the public. And I know this well because my entire career, I've had a mission to demystify biodiversity science through talking about biodiversity and the role of systematics in studying it. Well, until very, very recently, there was no way for me to present that challenge, that problem that we have in society in a visual way. But now there is a way. And I wanted to make a quick digression and tell you about what I discovered. So AI is all the rage now, and I'm sure it will continue. So OpenAI has a product called Dolly 2. And if you look on the screen here, you can see that the claim of OpenAI with this product is to generate realistic images. And the way this works, of course, is the AI engine takes the information available on the internet, and that information available on the internet largely reflects societal interests and information and impressions. So I asked the question, for generating quote unquote realistic images, what would Dolly 2 come up with for botanist? And this is what I found. So when I look at this, I'm concerned about a few things right off the bat. Notice that in all of these images, the plants are small, unattractive, and frankly, not really very approachable. So if that's the view society has, if they even are aware of plants, we've got to face up to it. And again, I've been aware of this. I deal with it all the time because I interact with the public quite a bit. I'm also concerned that all of the people depicted here are of European origin. Now, there's a lot more going on here, and I could go on and have a lecture just on this, but I'll point out some things that I find amusing too. It's interesting to me that all of the women look respectable, and one is even a bit glamorous. But when it comes to the guy, he's goofy. So what does that say about the impression of AI and society at large in terms of botanists? So then what I did was I did a search of Systematist. What would you think of yourself? And this is more of a rhetorical question, but you're welcome to write in to the chat if you want to put in some characteristics that you think Dolly too came up with for Systematist. So now I'm going to show you. Are you ready for this? Let's take a look. That's what we got. Would you want to go to this guy for having your plants identified? I don't think so. It's a real turnoff. And frankly, when I'm meeting people in public, like when I travel, I don't start out saying I'm a systematist, because I know that most people don't even know what that is. I often say I'm a biodiversity scientist, and that can lead to all kinds of interesting questions. So that brings up the point, what does Dolly 2 say for biodiversity scientist? And again, I was pretty disappointed with this one, especially those reptilian hands or whatever that guy has. Anyway, we got some problems here in terms of making the public aware of what we do. And that's why I'm on a mission. So I just wanted to present the context for systematics. And what I'd like to do now is talk about how systematics can help us understand how plants truly do rule the rainforest. And the first thing I'd like to do is talk about interactions. One of the hallmarks of tropical biology are complex interactions. So think of things like this example in which these mites temporarily ride on the beaks of hummingbirds to get transferred from one flower to another, from one suitable habitat to a developing suitable habitat to feed upon nectar and pollen. We also have all kinds of symbioses, including parasitism and mutualism and commensalism. For the rest of this talk, what I'd like to do is talk about two specific examples of these complex interactions. And the first one is seed dispersal. And I'll just pause now and see if anybody has any questions or comments. I love these comments that you're putting in about the white coats. I felt the same way. That bothered me too. So if you have any other questions or comments, please unmute. If you have any questions about anything so far, otherwise, I'll just go ahead. So in terms of seed dispersal, realize, of course, that the seeds are being dispersed within fruits, because the vast majority of plants in the rainforest are flowering plants. That's where most of the diversity is. And after flowers, assuming that fertilization has occurred, we get the development of fruits. So the seeds are contained inside the fruits. So fruits are packages for dispersing seeds to propagate species. And notice in that upper right photo of Moraceae, I got photobombed when I was taking a picture of that wild fig from the canopy walkway. I got photobombed by that bird, and I'll come back to that bird in just a little while. Well, seeds are dispersed through fruits, and one of the ways is to have juicy fruits. That one's pretty obvious because most fruits that we enjoy are juicy and delectable. Now, another way that seeds are dispersed is through arylate seeds. That means seeds having arils. Arils are fleshy, juicy coatings to seeds. They're actually a development, an outgrowth of the seed coat. Now, there are two main groups of animals that disperse fruits in the neotropics. One is monkeys, and we know a lot more about fruit and seed dispersal by monkeys than we do about the second group, namely birds. And I wanted to share with you some really interesting facts that I picked up from the literature about dispersal by each fruit. First, with monkeys, most species of neotropical monkeys eat fruit. And then some of them are actually almost completely frugivorous. And then here's some really compelling data points from the literature. Frugivorous monkeys actually increase the germination rate of seeds by 75% relative to those fruits and seeds that are unconsumed. And then spider monkeys, which are a relatively large monkey, and then tamarins, which are a relatively small monkey, these are groups that have been relatively well studied, and both of them disperse a heck of a lot of plant species and a huge number of seeds. I give you some figures there for annual dispersal rates. Now, what I'd like to do is turn your attention to this conundrum. Here's a situation in which we get these brightly colored seeds. And we know they're seeds because in the two examples I show you, the erythrina and the ormosia, we can actually see the fruit wall, which is dry at this point. Now, these seeds are brightly colored. And in fact, they're so brightly colored that they are used quite frequently in jewelry. And I'm sure you've seen jewelry like this, especially in the tropics. Well, there's a lot more in common with these plants than just the bright colors. And I want to share these traits with you. So what we know about these brightly colored seeds, and then I'll explain the rest of the conundrum, is first of all, they all belong to the legume family. This is the family that has peas and beans in it. And those plants that have these brightly colored seeds number in the hundreds, but they're not all of the legumes. The legume family is the third largest family of flowering plants. It has over 18,000 species of plants, and we're talking hundreds and hundreds, a large number, but not nearly the vast diversity of the family. But what we do find is there are 16 different lineages in the legumes that have these brightly colored seeds. What this means is there have been at least 16 independent origins of brightly colored seeds within the legumes. We find the seeds are brightly colored, as I say, they're often bichromatic. They have these contrasting patterns. They persist on the fruits. So that's one reason why you can see these fruits all dried out, yet the seeds are still there. And then another point is that the seed coats are very thick and hard and durable. As you can see in these photos, the seeds are exert. That means they stick out from the fruits and they create a prominent display by being exert. The seeds are capable of long dormancy, and the seeds have a toxic interior. And then finally, these are just seeds. They have no nutritive reward. So my question now is, what's going on? And I think somebody, Shannon, is a high achiever. This is great. I was going to ask you the question, what's going on here? And it looks like you're onto it. This mimicry is actually, as you'll see in a moment, the leading hypothesis for what's going on here. But it turns out this has not been well studied. It's an area of emerging research because it's only recently that scientists picked up on this pattern. And let me talk about the pattern for just a little bit. So it turns out that it appears that this pattern, all of these traits are shared in these hundreds of species, that they constitute a syndrome in evolutionary biology. And what a syndrome is a suite of co-adaptive features that meet a biological challenge. So I'm showing you a better known example here. We often talk about pollination syndromes. So for example, in bird pollination, we find that flowers are usually bright red, orange, or yellow, that the flowers are usually tubular, and they produce a lot of nectar. So here are these suite of co-adaptive features. Now back to our example, there you go. Shannon was a winner there. The leading hypothesis, and it is a hypothesis, it needs to be tested. The leading hypothesis is that there's a role of mimicry at play here. Well, you came up with mimicry, but the real question is, what about the toxic part? How does that make any sense? Well, the thinking is that birds are coming along that have been used to eating fruits or aerolite seeds. They mistake these brightly colored seeds in the legumes and they gobble them up. Well, they have thick seed coats, these seeds do, and they pass through the birds unharmed. But why are they toxic? Well, here's the apparent answer. In the legume family, there is a huge group of beetles that feed upon the seeds. And this is an example from North America because it's one of the best studied and illustrated. But this lineage of beetles is tremendously diverse in the tropics. And they have been found to feed largely on members of the bean family, just like here in the temperate zone. And what they do is the adults chew through the fruits all the way to the seeds, through the seed coat, deposit eggs. The larvae develop inside the eggs and they consume the interior of the seeds in the process. But these beetles don't make it inside these brightly colored seeds because of the toxins. These toxins are serious stuff. In fact, the most potent naturally occurring toxins known are those that occur in legumes with these brightly colored seeds. So it's really fascinating to see this whole suite of adaptations. Okay, I'd like to shift gears now and tell you about a second suite of adaptations that are involved in complex interactions. And this is in a group of insects that interacts directly with plants. And these are called the orchid bees. Just a fascinating group of insects. And what we find with the orchid bees is that they're big, they're stunningly beautiful, they're behaviorally complex, and I could go on and on and on for all the reasons they are incredibly fascinating. But what I'd like to do is just round this out by giving you a few more introductory points. First, on diversity, we find that the orchid bees constitute 5 genera and a total of about 230 species. All of them occur only in the Western Hemisphere. Almost all of them are neotropical, but there is one that has very recently become introduced into Florida and is spreading northward. So I can't say that they are exclusively neotropical. Most of the species are narrowly distributed, and most of them occur in mature, undisturbed rainforests. They pollinate a large number of flowering plant species, not just orchids. And some of these plants depend upon them as their exclusive pollinators, as we'll see in just a moment. And also, as we'll see in a moment, some of the bees are specific to just one or a very few plant species. Now, for all of these reasons and more, it turns out that orchid bees are excellent indicators of environmental health and environmental change. Also, as an evolutionary biologist, I find it fascinating that orchid bees appear to be powerful agents of natural selection that have led to the diversification of many groups of flowering plants. Okay, so here's an example of the intricate interaction between one species of orchid bee and one species of bucket orchid. These bucket orchids are incredibly complicated and specialized. They're called bucket orchids because a portion of the flower is shaped like a bucket, and indeed it collects fluid. And these orchids attract insects, especially orchid bees, by scents they release. And the orchid bees come and they find that the greatest concentration of nectar is just above the pool of fluid in the bucket. Well, that surface on which the nectar is produced is incredibly slippery, and invariably orchid bees slip down into the pool of fluid. But there's an easy way out, sort of. The thing about it being easy is there's a basically pathway to get out of the fluid, but it goes directly through the reproductive parts of the plant, the stigma and the mass of pollen. And what happens, you can start to see here in the leftmost panel, is that as the bee makes its way through this narrow channel, it contacts a part of the reproductive organs of the flower, and the pollen get glued to the back of the bee. And you can see all the way on the right, the bee has emerged, it's drying off after having come out of that fluid, and it has the pollen masses glued to its back. The glue is temporary. And what happens is this channel, as I mentioned, is quite narrow. The orchids usually attract a relatively small number of insects because of the fragrance being so specific. And then only one of these visitors is physically able to go through this tunnel. And that is this one species of orchid bee, Euglossa alleni. And this is I'm actually simplifying some of the pollination here, but this is a very tight association between this species of orchid bee and this species of orchid. Well, it turns out this genus of orchids, Coryanthes, the bucket orchids, is quite species rich, and virtually everyone has its own different orchid bee. So it's mind-boggling, the level of specialization and complexity here. It's really awe-inspiring. Okay, what I'd like to do now is focus on a bit of my research that was aided in great part by Krista and our program last summer at ACS. Well, here's some photos, not so much from Peru, but actually from Belize, and I'll explain the link there. Last year, I was very, very fortunate to be able to visit Belize and Peru within just a few months of each other. In Belize, where that northern red dot is a field station named BeFree, which is short for Belize Foundation for Research and Environmental Education. There, I was able to start studying orchid bees, and then I applied what I learned in terms of methodology at the ACS field station in Peru in July. And the really wonderful thing about it was I had the same amount of time to study and document through collections the orchid bees at both sites, at both BeFree and ACS. And this is what I found. I finally, just this week, finished identifying all the species of orchid bees that we collected at ACS last summer. And here's the comparison between ACS and BeFree. It's really interesting. At ACS, we collected a total of 45 specimens, 4 genera and 15 species of bees. At BeFree in Belize, we got more specimens, almost twice the number, but fewer genera and substantially fewer species. So one of the things that prior research has indicated is that orchid bee diversity reaches its maximum in Amazonia. And this quick comparison from just a couple of short trips indicate that it really seems to be the case. There's obviously a lot more to be done at ACS, but this is a nice start for it. And I wanted to mention this. And as I said, at both places, I was able to put in a total of 7 hours. Now, I want to mention that at ACS, I had help from Jordan Wolf. So that 7 hours is 7 person hours in total. So with that comparison, having like number of hours, we can do this comparison. Now, there are all kinds of other questions like, was the seasonality the same? Well, we don't know, but for a first quick comparison, we have some tantalizing results. How did the ACS results of 4 genera and 15 species compare with a previous study? Fortunately, there are many studies in Amazonia of orchid bees, and the one that was done the closest to ACS was in the vicinity of Iquitos, only about 50 miles away, and it was conducted by Rasmussen and published in 2009. In that study, Rasmussen collected for a total of 27 days and 108 hours versus our 3 days for a total of 7 hours. He found 33 species. He collected nearly all the species we found at ACTS, no big surprise. But what was surprising and interesting is that there were a couple of exceptions. So we found 2 species, Euglassa ioprosoba and Euglassa stilbonota, that Rasmussen did not collect. So then the question becomes, so what? What does it really mean? Is it significant? Does it mean anything? Or is it just sort of random noise? Well, this series of distribution maps should help put this in perspective. On the left, we see Euglassa ignita, which is the species that we collected most commonly. We had the greatest number of specimens out of the entire batch of 45 specimens. And you can see it is indeed a very common species. Second and third are the 2 species that we collected that were not documented in the prior study. And you can see that ioprosoba is considerably less common, apparently, than ignita. And then finally, stilbonota is genuinely a rare species. In fact, only 1 prior known collection from all of Peru. So this is pretty exciting. Again, it's tantalizing. We need a lot more work to do. And indeed, in this upcoming summer, we hope to continue this work and expand it quite a bit with the help of a lot of teachers in the RE program. So this is a nice beginning for what we hope to be a long-term monitoring study of orchid bees. And this should inform us about environmental health and change in the Sukasari Axe Explorer Napo region. And what I'd like to do at this point is acknowledge many institutions who have been incredibly generous and helpful with this work, and also several individuals. I am especially grateful to Krista for inviting me to participate last summer and making this work possible. I also thank Jordan Wolf, who helped me with collecting orchid bees. Ben Torkey is my colleague here at New York Botanical Garden, who is an expert on the legume family and made me aware of these mimetic seeds and started me off on my interesting quest to learn more about them, and that allowed me to share the information with you tonight. I'm also very grateful to our Explorama guides and the entire Huna community of Sukasari, because the Huna have been incredibly welcoming and helpful. And without them, what we do really would not mean as much, and we would not be able to do it, in fact. So with that, I'd like to invite questions, invite you to unmute. Please ask questions. You can put them in the chat too if you want, but certainly it would be great to have some interaction. So I'm going to stop sharing screens and invite you to go ahead and ask away.
Rob, can you address just a little bit about the diversity gradient and why we see more plant diversity in the tropics than we do in North America?
Sure.
How that maybe influences other levels of biodiversity as well?
Krista, that's a great question. Thank you. So what we find in general is that as we approach the equator, as we approach the tropics, diversity increases, and it does not increase in a linear fashion. It actually goes exponential. So a good example of that would be the palms. In terms of distribution in the Northern Hemisphere, we find that native palms make it as far north as southeastern North Carolina. And we have 1 species there. And as we work southward, by the time we hit Northern Florida, we have 4 species. By the time we reach Southern Florida, we're up to at least a dozen. And on as you get to the equator, you're in the hundreds. So that's one example of what we call the latitudinal diversity gradient. this trend from most groups of organisms to greatly increase in diversity as we approach the equator. Now, the big question becomes why? Well, certainly it appears that favorable conditions through history are a big part of the reason. So the tropics have not been glaciated. Some parts of the tropics have been affected by glaciations, but they have not themselves been directly glaciated. One of the big reasons why diversity is not as great as we move toward the poles is the ebb and flow through history of glaciers. And when glaciers expand, they wipe out everything in their path, because glaciers, as part of continental glaciation, are typically at least 1 mile thick. So there's no way, and they persist for many thousands of years. So there's no way for organisms to survive. So anyway, that's a quick overview of it. We do find that the long-term, relatively stable climates of the tropics are a big part of the reason, but also, especially in the wet tropics and the rainforests, we find those favorable conditions are we find the greatest biodiversity, because there's virtually everything that life needs to survive within the rainforests. So, Krista, I hope that answered the question for you. I hope I covered everything that you were wondering about.
Absolutely. Yes, yes, indeed. There was a question in the chat earlier from Herb about fish and the connection between fish and, I believe, seed dispersal. Is that right, Herb? Yeah, fish and flooded forests. Do you know anything about that?
Sure. Thank you. I'm sorry I missed that question earlier, but I see it now. So thanks, Krista, for bringing it to my attention. Yeah, there are a number of trees. Some palms are one example that are dispersed primarily, if not exclusively, by fish. And what happens is when the fruits mature, they fall, and that seasonality tends to coincide with when the water levels are high in Amazonia. And so the seeds get dispersed by the water, and the fish find them, and the fruits are attractive to the fish. They're food. And typically, these fruits that are dispersed by fish have seeds that can resist the digestive system. So a lot of these fish chew on the fruits. They chew off fleshy pulp, and it's very nutritional. And then the fish are attracted to that, and the fish will often spit out the seeds. And those that are not spit out by the fish are ingested and pass through the digestive system, and they typically will still germinate afterwards. So it's another one of these complex interactions. There's a whole group of many species of fish that disperse fruits. I wish I knew more about the fish themselves. And if any of you that are in attendance do, please speak up, because that's about the limit of my knowledge.
And please, everybody, feel free to unmute or drop questions in the chat. This is your chance. Botany 101, Rainforest Botany 101, Rainforest Intrigue, you name it. Plants are the bomb. I have to admit, while I'm waiting for questions, I never had a botany class. And I have to say, following Rob around the rainforest, it's like he's speaking a language that I don't have the vocabulary for. And I just have this feeling that he walks through a physical environment and greets plants in ways of familiarity that I can't do. And I don't consider myself plant blind. I really appreciate them very much, but I just don't have the background in it. And these associations are just, to me, are just magic, like how these things have co-evolved and the complexity of it all. So other questions, jump in there, everybody.
I have a question. Hi, Rob. I'm Kathy, and I'm going to try to articulate as best I can. So coming from a temperate climate, I know that trees, for instance, support each other through their root system to the extension of fungi, and they can help each other when the food gets scarce, what have you. Now, when you get close to the tropics and you have a greater diversity and more, if you will, competition between plants, do you have such cooperation that occurs? Or is it a sort of a plant eat plant kind of world when you get to a hot biodiverse area?
Kathy, that's a great question. And the immediate response is we really don't know yet.
I thought you would say that.
Yeah, what has been learned is that you're absolutely right. The diversity of fungi as well as of the flowering plants, including the trees, just is incredible. It's super high. And yes, there's competition. And actually, and studies have been done in the temperate zone. So much of what we know is first discovered in the temperate zone, and then those hypotheses that are supported by those studies are then tested in the tropical zone. But one of the things that we've discovered is competition actually is one of the aspects of the environment that seems to drive diversification. So in those areas when we get intense competition, we often find higher diversity than in those areas where we have fewer species that do not compete with each other as much. So it seems counterintuitive, but when you think about it more, it starts to make sense, because instead of a few species hogging lots of resources, so to speak, we find many, many more species that specialize and divide up the environment and the resources in finer ways. So we find niches to be much more narrow and much more specific. So we find many more specialists, ecologic specialists, and fewer generalists. And as I say, when we get those simpler environments that are dominated by fewer species, usually those are more generalist species, ecologically speaking. So I don't know any particulars or examples to give you, but I do know some mycologists, some fungi specialists who are going in this direction. They're studying the fungal networks, including underground, and they're uncovering exceedingly complicated situations that they're still striving to and struggling to understand.
Great, thank you so much. May I ask one more question?
By all means.
What about the volatile chemical communications between plants? We know about some of the tannins that can be spread from plant to plant, even across species, if an herbivore is chewing around on one plant. Have they discovered in the tropics that there's a communication that occurs biochemically, I guess I would say, volatile chemically, across the plant world, where there's a big alarm call that goes out and everyone becomes distasteful?
Kathy, another great question. In the relatively few studies that have been done, yes, those kind of interactions that we see in temperate zone forests, they are being replicated in many ways at a gross level, of course, in the tropics. When they've been studied, they have found that yes, there are chemicals that alarm, and that allows certain plants that are able to do it to build up higher levels of defensive compounds in their leaves. Those kinds of things have been shown in tropical environments, yes. So I'd like to follow up on the question that you asked, Krista, because I realize I actually did not answer quite all of it. You were asking about that trend for greater diversity as one goes toward the tropics. And I gave the example of orchid bees, and I showed how, in one example with the bucket orchids, how there has been this apparent coevolution between the bees and the plants. Well, that's one example of why, besides the examples I gave, the specifics I gave about the more stable and favorable environments of the tropics, the complex biological interactions themselves allow for diversification. And so I wanted to add that because one of the mysteries that we have is what I referred to earlier, that the relationship is not just linear, it's actually an exponential one. As you approach the tropics, diversity increases at an exponential rate, much greater than might be expected otherwise. So it appears that one of the reasons for this is these complex interactions. Symbioses, for example, are much more complex, better developed in the tropics, they involve many more partners than we find in the temperate zone. So I thought I would add that too to help answer. And I'm sorry I didn't think of adding that before.
No, that's great. Thank you for circling back around to that. I guess the one question that comes up with, all this hyper diversity, let's call it, across species and genera and all of that, like what are the implications of that as far as the plant communities and climate change, and as in my mind, the foundational part of what makes that system work rests on the shoulders of plants and the animals. So I don't know, chicken egg kind of a thing, but like, can you address some of the climate change concerns about plants and the environment in the tropics, Amazon in particular?
I'm glad you raised that, Krista, because so much of this is so important because of the conservation crisis we're in. And the conservation crisis is climate change, it's habitat destruction, it's on and on and on. So we want to look at this in an informed way, and that's why it's helpful to learn about these fundamental drivers of biodiversity, the interconnectedness, as you say, chicken and egg. Absolutely. Which came first? So I gave the example of seed dispersal by birds and by monkeys. And what we find is that we're going to be in big trouble if we lose one or the other, meaning either the plant partner or the disperser partner, because they're so interdependent. So in terms of climate change, the real fear is that as the system gets pushed farther and farther by changes, one or the other partner may start to break down. And if so, then it becomes a downward spiral and could happen very rapidly. So imagine those monkeys. What would happen if we lost monkey diversity for a long time within an area? Then we lose much of seed dispersal. Then regeneration of trees drops off. And then as trees die, whether they fall or they die in place, there are gaps in the forest. Maybe those gaps can't be filled. Then with the weather, assuming it's still raining a lot there, the soil gets washed, and then on and on and on. And you can imagine just how deleterious it becomes if these complex ecological interactions start to break down. So that's, again, one of the hallmarks of the tropics is these complex trophic and other ecological interactions, feeding and energy flow interactions, nutrient cycling. They're all interconnected. That interconnectedness is something we all depend on, yet we've taken for granted.
Thanks for that. And I don't want to, please jump in with questions. Excellent read by Herb Thompson, The Invention of Nature. Terrific book. If you haven't read that, we did that in our Amazon book club, our first book, I think. And then I'm just dropping in the chat too. There's a really great podcast about the disappearing botanists of the world on Manga Bay. And for educators out there, it really hits on all of these things with regards to plants and getting kids outside and understanding their crucial role in the environment. And it speaks to Rob's profession as, a systemist. Did I say that right? I always say that wrong. There just aren't enough people studying and learning about and understanding how these plants are operating in the environment and their interactions, let alone identifying them. So let's wrap up with final questions from anybody out there in the virtual world. Drop it in the chat or unmute yourselves.
Thank you very much for those readings. They're great.
There's another one that we're reading coming up. I think it's coming up in our May book club. Shoot, I don't have it right in front of me, but the Banana Leaves is in the title, and it's about indigenous knowledge and sustainable agriculture, which I think will be a good one. So Yeah, it was funny. Rob and I have been working on some background readings for our ARI program. Brief intro to the Maya Huna community that you mentioned earlier. That's coming from Elizabeth, and I think Elizabeth's new to this this webinar series. So welcome, Elizabeth. You want to give a little bit of an introduction, Rob, to the Maya Huna from your perspective?
Sure. I had not heard of the Maya Huna until my very first visit to Peru, and people were talking about them, and I thought, okay, let's see. So we had the wonderful honor to visit the Maya Huna in their Sukasari village at the time that they were having other villages within the Maya Huna community visit for an annual convention. They rotate their convention every year, and that happened to be the time that it happened at the nearby village. So we were invited over by them, which I thought was pretty positive because I've interacted with other indigenous communities in other parts of the world and found that it can take a long time to earn their trust. So I didn't know what to expect, but we visited, and my first visit was after dark. One evening, we pulled in by boat. We arrived at the village, and I discovered there was a hill up above the floodplain to get up to where the village proper was. So I climbed up the hill, and I was confronted by a nice group of men and women, but mostly men. They were the welcoming committee. And the next thing that happened was absolutely marvelous. One of these Maya Huna men came up and gave me a big hug. And that was his way of welcoming me. And it was magical. So then what we did the next couple of days during daylight was we visited and we learned about the Maya Huna way of life, especially their agriculture, their cooking, their culture in terms of various handicrafts, a lot more as I'm remembering. And it was just a tremendous experience. And to cap it all off, as their convention was ending, they had a big feast, and they invited all of us to their feast. So as an outsider, I was already tremendously honored. And when we arrived, we stood around waiting for them to get started, and they turned to us and they said, "No, you're the guests, you get started." So I give these as just a couple of examples, these stories, to let you know just how wonderfully warm and welcoming the Maya Huna are. They also are incredibly aware of the wonderful environment in which they live. So they're committed to conservation, and it's tremendously inspiring to see how they live with the land and they live sustainably. So that's my take on it. I'm not an expert. Krista and many of the rest of you can add a lot more, and you're welcome to do that now that I've had my say.
Yeah, I'll just add a few more words. We've been very, very privileged to have the opportunity to collaborate and partner with the Maya Huna. And it's a very, well, historically, it's been a positive conservation story, or in the recent history, it's been a positive conservation story. In 2015, they were given ownership, titled lands within a 1 million acre conservation area. And so we started collaborating with them through the work of Mike Gilmore and One Planet, and through the support of Explorama Lodges. Explorama is where we base all of our field studies at their Axe Canopy Walkway site and their Napo Lodge, and it's just downriver from the community of Sukasari. So we've just had, through these partnerships and these collaborations with Explorama and One Planet, introduced to the Maya Huna. And as Pam pointed out in the chat, these relationships have been built over decades, and we have benefited from those relationships that have been established long before we arrived on the scene. We got involved because we work with educators, and we bring educators to the Amazon, and the Maya Huna had recently been given ownership of this land, and we're looking to diversify their sustainable development projects, and ecotourism was a part of that. And we said, hey, have we got the audience for you? Let's start this off with workshops for teachers. And we were just getting rolling with that. And then, of course, COVID, stupid COVID, came along. So last year we got things going again. And, it's been really terrific because it's added a traditional ecological lens to all of this. You know, we're all North American scientists and researchers and educators. And so we've had the great opportunity to have this indigenous perspective on everything from, you know, conservation to plants to sustainable use of agriculture to their stingless bee project. And it's just been amazing. And so there's nothing quite like walking through a forest with a North American botanist and an indigenous elder talking and comparing ideas and thoughts about what they're seeing and what their stories are and what they know and what they understand, and having those two ways of knowing a forest be like happening right in front of you is pretty phenomenal and quite the experience. So yeah, that's more than a little introduction. Sorry, Elizabeth, you got a little bit more than you bargained for. So any other last questions? We do try to honor the hour time limit. I do want to just thank Rob like profusely. And he's got a very big job at the Botanical Garden, and he graciously gives his time not only for these projects, but also graciously gives his time to us in the Amazon as a faculty member and a leader of our ARI program. So thank you, Rob. We couldn't do this work without you.
Thank you, Krista.
All right. morphoinstitute.org/ whatever it is, events for everything that's upcoming. And yeah, follow us on social media too. We try to update as much as possible about when these things are coming. So thanks, Rob. Rob's off to Belize soon. Poor Rob's got to go to Belize in February or March. Feel bad for you. Have fun.
Thank you. Looking forward to it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Rob.
Nice to see everybody. Thank you.